Hello everyone, very simple video today about Italian communal statutes. I remember in Schwerpunkt's early days I made a video about guilds and statutes, something along that pattern, I think in the 12th, 13th century. This is basically almost, say, the same chronology, but naturally something a bit more advanced. Again, it's a simple video, it just illustrates the importance of statutes. Why statutes are important. Why are we discussing them on Schwerpunkt? Well, because they fundamentally regulated the entire institutional and political and social, also military profile of the Italian communes that at this point also affirmed themselves as city-states and in fact required an increasingly large administrative body to run this incredibly big, powerful, rich systems with, we're talking the largest cities of the era, all confined within also this regional space. We're talking 30 centers, especially in this era where they weren't basically able to take each other out, if not by sort of gradual attrition across the generation. So you would think this is a boring topic. Well, it's never really a boring topic when you get to the point of the matter, that is to say how this actually allowed things to work per se. Today we will look in part at the creation and the revision of these statutes that were essentially making up the constitutions of the Italian city-states in, again, a communal period, so also in proto-statal times. I've never really been particularly into archive sources, and statutes are fundamentally researched through this. Then, as historians, we often get basically the sources that we need from those who sort of more specialistically get into the archive and so on. You would say Schwerpunkt, but if you don't go by to archives, what do you do? Well, you can absolutely, like I'm doing, like publishing in the top Anglo-American military history journals without needing to go to any archive, because historiography is plenty dealing with similar sources, statutory ones. Sometimes, mostly, every source comes fundamentally from the archive, especially at this time, but you don't have to necessarily be the guy who go picks the stuff over there. And why am I talking about archival sources? Because statutes are studied in sort of metaphysics and historiography, especially when you look at the Italian communes, as a very sort of specifically technical source that requires also an equally specific expertise to cope with them, also from a philological, documentary, also paleographical, codicological point of view, and of course a massive knowledge of how these sources sort of entwine with one another. Just to make an example, given that we also finished our series about medieval Florence recently. Florence has by far, for different reasons, the largest amount of communal archival material. And you would think that by 2025, more or less, like there was something about medieval sources, also this technical administrative nature, more or less people have sort of studied it, have browsed them. Maybe the latter browsing is true. To have systematically, organically, structurally, and positively researched and studied these sources is a completely different story. It's as if we sit on this massive treasures that people say, well, what's about that? Well, understanding literally how a medieval city worked to an unprecedented, by the way, degree of documentation for compared to any other polity. Meaning that this kind of sources, we just dream of them for, even the major national monarchies of the era. But you have in specific cities, some archives went entirely destroyed. For example, Milan, that was even more important than Florence. We don't have that. There are statutes, there are sources of that kind. But other big, the Neapolitan kingdom. I'm preparing a video about King Robert of Anjou. The Neapolitan archives went famously destroyed during World War II. So these are some of the, by magnitudinal scale, some of the greatest tragedies in the history of mankind. And people do not even know that they happened, what it means, right? I have, in this sense, in the last decades, grown through the internet, in a sense, looking at people in general, groups, sort of anthropological aspects of, say, how people interact with history. And of course, there is a level of, first of all, enormous disappointment regarding how or why people get interested in history, if they get into it at all. And there are all the worst possible reasons, to an extent. There's probably a level of low animal kind of emotional basis to that is appalling and horrifying. On the other hand, you realize that certain historical topics, it's not like they are, I don't know, they're maybe more niche, but somebody can get there. This stuff, I'm sure, there is not even a single person who, on the entire billions of videos uploaded on YouTube, had anything to do with this. It's just those things that are big in the respective fields of research, but I mean very big just by the quantities that we've said now, but that people have literally no clue that they even exist. This is, of course, important because, as you know, I made multiple videos. Now we're talking about medieval Italy, for example. I was shocked, literally shocked, last year when I made that, or it was early this year, I remember, anyway, roughly 1 year ago, I made that video about the Battle of Tagliacozzo, the Palentinian Plains, the famous battle between Charles of Anjou and Conrad in Swabia. And I was shocked to realize that I was the only person who had basically described the battle, the thing, on YouTube. I mean, it's there are videos about this battle, but they have nothing to do with the history of the battle, nor with any kind of, I mean, it can be just a pasted and copied Wikipedia level kind of, I don't know, this thing happened, 12 minutes explaining things that are sort of basic, that make you immediately understand the person that's reading them has probably, never even properly entered the historical context. And God knows where they find the sources. I mean, I know where I find my own sources, and I know especially how to work on them, how to create these videos in ways that are both accessible and sort of also expandable, because it's not like they take the thing of sources lightly. There are lots of people, since this is a video about sources to an extent, or at least since the statute is really essentially a text you have to read and treat with some aforementioned expertise. It's not like I'm insensitive to the story of the sources. There are people, basically, aside from those who, of course, do not distinguish the fact that even if you don't list a bibliography, like many channels do, by pasting and copying from Grok without having read any of the books, nor having made anything of the video on the basis of them, think that if you don't do that, in fact, you're not historically accurate, right? These people confuse the most fundamental notions of reliability, accuracy. I've been quite vocal about this with different videos, including the ones with Veritas and Caritas. I mean, there is a graceful way to history, which, being online, makes me realize that nobody really fundamentally understands, or really nobody fundamentally imagines even, or is probably something so beyond the average. I'm not even taking much sort of, merit out of this. It's so easy, like it's so basic just to be minimally above this reality and just already, dealing with the big deal stuff in relation to that stage, that, I don't have really much else to add. Right. Besides, when we look at sources, again, this topic seems, again, more like, I don't know, literary. God knows how people think about this. They think that if you talk about sources or this kind of more, in fact, dispositive, institutional, administrative texts, you're talking about something abstract that has no connection with what they want to see, like, I don't know, knights smashing each other's heads with maces or whatever. They don't understand that the reason why knights could exist to do these things in the effective way they could, with orderly armies from an orderly society and disciplined politics, so derived, also passed through, at least largely, this level of organization, right? It's just like, as we've seen in the videos about HEMA, like people in those environments basically brainwash themselves from decades online, essentially indoctrinating themselves. This is de facto religious mechanism, where to them, like they establish a boundary that is merely deterministic and materialistic, and there is nothing outside. I mean, the entire political, moral, and exquisitely military, which, remember, with the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity is connected with properly the concept of gamble and unpredictability. If you don't understand that, you can't have any military literacy whatsoever, not understanding military logic. And, they don't even imagine, in fact, that there is a bridging path between this kind of, something more sort of static or ideally even mechanical and actual reality, which is a completely different thing. This is the level of the type of feelings and ideas that such discussions stimulate. Also, especially because when you look at, for example, the communal statutes, you realize that legislative texts as such were also much wider in kind compared to the specific statutes. We've seen sometimes in the medieval university history videos how, say, the history of law, in fact, how these legislative texts were produced. There are many. There are some more theoretical works for general expandability. Some were university texts, etc. These statutes, of course, were something different. They were the texts that regulated properly the communal government. And in general, legislative texts, as we've seen, occupied the most important position at the time for the regulation of society. Remember that the doctors in law, if you look at the Bolognese Romanistic studies, they were literally knighted. All right, they were considered to increase properly, to augment the civitas's imperium, just by this rationalizing providential vision, wisdom, in fact, that also allowed the city to make an incredibly large amount of money. We're not talking about here all the prejudices allegedly called mercantile, but these were essentially military states, right? The power, money translated into having literally the largest armies in medieval Europe. And therefore, you understand how lucrative, but also intelligent and positive and civilizational this activity was. It's been estimated in some areas, like in the Nievole Valley in Tuscany, it was a particularly civilized place. 1/3 of the local families were basically involved in notary activity for the communes largely, but also for private matters, and they were all one with that. Because, of course, also this public authority that was the strongest in Italy, again, civilly in meant terms, was, however, still the one of a medieval state. And so something definitely not absolute, right, as it could be in the nation one in the 19th century. Now, the act of recording laws in written form, typically encompassing customs and decisions that form the basis of statutes, because, of course, these are mostly the legislational part, there had to be a legal basis for that, constitutes a fundamentally political endeavor. You cannot understand statutes if you think that they are just some random pieces of parchment, later paper in this period, that fundamentally emerged from nowhere and or were just abstractly regulating something that at the end of the day you don't understand, because let's be honest, you've never even studied any historiography on the Italian communes, which is an enormous deficit in any possible sort of cultural sense by 2025 in particular. What this means is that, of course, every statute must be read as the expression of a specific political will, like any law at any given time. that can reveal quite concretely how, in fact, politics worked in this given community. So this process of recording laws that included eventually the same statutes that became law accordingly aimed to guarantee the law's clarity during its enforcement by judges and to ensure equitable treatment of citizens. We have seen in many videos what was essentially happening in these communes. During the 12th century, you have still like the consular military regime that at some point locks the access to the same. And so this was all codified, and so we can't study through the studies this exact thing. So at some point, the so-called unquote people that is still basically citizenry and also pretty affluent people at the top, not necessarily the merchants, or those are just classistic readings that have no meaning. This is all eminently political, also with very horizontal divide that have nothing, in fact, particularly to do with any class struggle per se. If you read this story, it's not much. There are forces socioeconomically influencing, but it's the mentality that produces the struggles, and also just the effectiveness of the political siding resides, in fact, in a more hierarchically traditional direction, which is not really an option, especially considering the shocking civilizational accomplishments of these city-states compared to the rest of the world at this point. But things got pretty brutal as well. Right, there were frequent exiles, there's increasing factionalism, there's even a paralysis at some point of the communal politics, communal political life. Between the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century, you have basically the necessity of calling an external ruler in the vest of the podesta to have the statutes respected. The podesta was a single ruler coming again from another Italian city-state that had, in theory, to be outside. In fact, they were normally importantly distant. I don't know, if you were in western Tuscany, you would call somebody from northeastern Italy, something of this kind. They considered each other foreigner, at least to the linguistical extent that they called foreigner someone that, in any case, spoke their same identical language, as a matter of fact. Because that's yet another feature that nobody ever gets wrong. The fact that central northern Italy, so basically the Italic kingdom and beyond, was split into 30 city-states has absolutely nothing to do with some alleged fractal socio-cultural background to them. On the contrary, the institutional development of the Italian communes across this entire area, with the facto independent city-states that can do more or less whatever they want internally, is rigidly uniform. If you look at the phases of this, for example, the affirmation of the commune with a consular regime, and the Podesta's affirmation, the creation of the popolo, they're all more or less across these tens of centers, across the same generation. Right? There are exceptions. No city, again, is literally equal to another, but this system was so drastically compact, developed, rich, literate, that basically everybody continuously knew whatever all the others were doing, also because they were beating the hell out of one another on a regular basis with a disconcertingly large amount of military effort, and literally nowhere to be seen compared in relative terms compared to the rest of Europe, other regions of Europe. This has been very well documented, by the way, also including by Contamine, by Mer Vigueur. There is really a lot of stuff on this. Again, I'm appalled to realize how literally nobody studies this stuff, and has especially no clear clue or idea of the whole picture. I mean, one thing is saying, okay, no, I will make a video about Dante or the Battle of Montaperti, or the stories of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, but knowing the actual history of every single one of these states, and not even through the sort of 2 hours long per each or per even generation of single communes like I do on Schwerpunkt, is null compared to the complexity and the level of documentation of these centers. And if you realize how also history is made for other countries, only at that point you can start, if you were properly inexperienced in all this, the scale, right, of sources of information, of development, of force that is agitating there. So imagine the statutes exactly as a reflection of this. And so not some sort of, more soft civilized lifestyle of some, loft merchant oligarchies, but literally single most bellicose and properly military invested and this powerful and destructive at the same and richer and continuously consuming powers of the era. And the statutes in particular, then basically in the 13th century, the state is affirmed, especially with the popolo, that is, again, the people that manages to create some sort of police mechanism whereby the older military clans are, at least within the city streets, challenged to the degree they can't put everything ablaze during their constitutional feuds, like you would see, in feudal Europe, because their lifestyle was identical with their house towers, their countryside castles, and so on. In fact, most of the struggle would continue in the countryside, I've seen many videos, because there the popular paramilitary forces, mostly of infantry, would not venture. The communes had a proper army with a proper capacity, in fact, to arm large bodies of infantry, also largely in paid ways at a point, especially the sort of the core, the backbone of the same. The popular paramilitary forces were just this sort of greatest effort with least effort, given that, especially within the narrow city streets, infantry, the rage of the people, could definitely put cavalry habituated to space with great maneuverability in open field in very dire straits. So at that point you have the sublimations of statutes in a most statally directed, consolidated fashion, something that, to an extent that today we will not get into the later Middle Ages, will still be there even during the seigneurial era, because the communes kept being ruled as communes even when they were under some foreign control, like during the age of the lordships, with just one city that rules all over the others, or at least many others. So when we look at statutes, we're looking mostly at this phase, the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century, because the statutes production is characteristic of a popular sentiment, prompting the creation of a book of customs, for example, in Milan in 1216. And Milan was pretty big, and so it's also just the beginning of the 13th century. They hadn't yet sort of uniformed, or at least collected and regularized all this set of Ambrosian laws. This period, again, in the early 13th century was, as previously noted, characterized by considerable unrest in the city to begin with. And this is in particular true for Milan, that I made a video, 2 videos on, as a matter of fact, as looking at particularly this communal phase in its sort of broader political history. And comparable efforts were subsequently undertaken in numerous other cities as well. Communal legislation is neither established once and for all, right? The commune always needs new laws. What we're witnessing to here is rather the rise of a more compact body of essentially statutory laws, and so essentially a constitution, from an ongoing process of creation and adaptation. When you look at terms like constitution, be aware of the fact that it's not like constitutions started magically to spawn from nowhere in the 18th and 19th century. Right? There were some political systems that had brutally pioneered this from centuries and centuries, and that you just don't read in history sources because either they went under and or they sort of still had another process of political agglutination later on on a country basis, on a national basis, in this case with Italy, that was not unified politically until the 19th century. The rediscovery of Roman law naturally plays a crucial role in all this, because it's simply a much more complex juridical system that fits much better the needs of a proper state. As we explained countless times, the Italians were the ones who not just recovered Roman law, but did so from, in fact, an already much more developed legal practice in theory compared to the rest of Europe in the up to the 11th century. All right, they historically had their national law, essentially the Longobard Code, that was during the same Longobard Kingdom extended by different sovereigns after Rotary's foundation. And you had the Carolingian capitularies, and so basically all the laws that were issued by the Italic kings and the and emperors, all the Roman emperors. Then there is a feudal law that emerges just as a customary one, just like also the same Roman one had emerged like from it, most of the Longobard one. There are all the influences you can imagine between, say, the Longobards, the Franks. There are the communes that naturally also are born at some point and start immediately legislating. And it's happening more or less at the same time. In fact, and they came from already a pretty developed governmental system, the one of the bishops' counts, from the 10th. The 11th century itself. We've seen this also as far as the church growth is concerned, like the church was producing a shockingly impactful amount of juridical texts that would develop essentially like ecclesiastical regulations across Europe. And this goes literally au pair in tandem with lay, so to say, law or civil law, as Roman law basically is, even though Roman law paradoxically at some point becomes common law for the same communes. This will happen later towards the 14th century. I'm sorry that I made an entire series, a complete series about the history of medieval law in a time in which Schwerpunkt did not have so many views, and so most of those videos are not famous and probably would have not been watched because, as we explained at the beginning, it's not like a person may understand, I don't know, why the history of medieval law is important. No, you want to see just the European religion stuff, because we all know that it's only through that you can understand everything, with remaining ignorant as a goat about literally everything else. That's exactly what the Indo-Europeans, by the way, taught. But according to you, like that's really, like, you see, these are deep problems of today's people. They don't even know what they do. They don't understand anything. They fantasize. They don't, even when there is actually good stuff, because I consider my Indo-European religious history is pretty relevant to an extent in today's time. It's not like this is tied to an overall acknowledgement of how I got there or how I developed my own also military and religious studies. Well, no, it's just the most important thing is that you click on something that makes you feel in the moment, oh, looks cool. Maybe just the thumbnail sometimes, who knows, like pictures like children at a time. And not specifically complaining with those that sort of support by watching per se. But I'm just observing the analytics. And there is you don't see this because it's from within my account, my channel, but the picture that is vividly painted here is incredibly depressing regarding the actual level of culture and education, because something tells me that getting less views for this kind of civic history videos is not connected with the fact that you somehow know too much already about that, right? And that's exactly the main issue. The recovery of Roman law was necessary within, again, this incredible civilizational escalation of the era. Nobody, again, in Europe worked as the Italic kingdom by any stretch of the imagination. These people were light years ahead in terms of every level of civic, cultural, artistic, literary, and probably juridical standpoint. And their economy, right, that's also what moves a lot of things, right? Needing contracts, needing broader organization, but state building in particular. And this, and especially Roman law, helped the state to affirm its authority. Drawing on the imperial example that naturally was also claimed in the West at this point, because we also have the crowd that naturally watches my videos but still literally does not understand that the Roman Empire continued in the West, what Romanity is, and how these people literally believed. And they were the actual continuators of the Roman civilizational legacy. Don't think it's Constantinople for that matter. But again, this statement is yet one another of those I said before that people do not really even see, they don't even suspect what it means. Like, it's not that they listen to me and may imagine some level of what I'm talking about. And why? Because of course they know absolutely nothing about any of these topics. Right? To them, it's some sort of, paradox game where you have, the different colors of different states, and here it's, a struggle for resources, whatever. Do you actually even know how these communities were regulated, how they worked politically? Do you know what state building in the Middle Ages worked like? Have you ever studied this specific context? Do you know what, Frederick Barbarossa's legislation at the Diet of Roncaglia was? Well, okay, let's skip this at least. The other crucial aspect is tradition here. At this point, it's not city councils, but city consuls. Also in city councils, but still from this consular that is military, means literally the milites, the knights, background, articulate the communal legislative aspirations and distinctive legal culture. The communes were founded by the Italic milites, right? And as such, they were basically, again, people intended as wearing the cingulum militaris, incarnating the fullest, especially in these areas of Europe, Romano-Germanic legacy of freedom in arms equated to personal nobility and part of divinity, of sacred rule. So they had specifically vocational and, in fact, providential meaning of this. You're persuaded to imagine, the communes, especially as they developed later and never devoid of these elements, as something more, again, clumsily, democratic or republican, or whatever you want to call this. You see, this is the reason why people have literally never heard anything about pure European culture, medieval civilization, universal tradition. They don't understand what the empire is. They don't understand what was happening here, why the emperor was there, why the crown of Italy was associated with the Holy Roman Imperial one. Why would, a German ruler try its best to rule from the Italian peninsula as opposed from Germany? If you have never answered these questions in your life, you may not be exactly where you want to be as a human being. Now, the laws issued by the commune are the ones that we probably refer to as statutes, together with customs, constituting a unique legal framework of the city and its surrounding territory. In other words, what was known at the time as the jus proprium. Right? In a sense, in fact, there was no difference here between the two types of legislation. The communal one as a tendentially, at least, subtle one, because the consular regime does not arrive to statehood, at least in conventionally historiographical terms. There is some sort of statehood already, but it's something really different. The idea of an overarching communal power that is hyperstatic expression of the entire mystical body of the universitates, so the corporations, so the entire, that is not simply the guilds, it's not just the socio-economical, it's literally every single community, including from, the knightly ones, the mercantile, the notarial one, they were part of the same identical clans, by the way, were expression of, right? And so when there is already some customary law, for example, that is also particular about a given place, and we will see at some point how complicated the thing gets if you remember what I said before regarding the homogeneity of the actual, development of the Italian communal, in this case, legal framework. Well, yeah, but the exceptionality of this, that this was done, in fact, from a background that was, in fact, more diverse, historically speaking. And that is what gives you the dimension of this powerful compaction. The Peace of Constance, after the imperial defeat at the hands of the Lombard League, acknowledged the laws enacted by each commune. These were properly mentioned one by one, notoriously enough, at Constance by Frederick Barbarossa. In fact, the communes stipulated themselves with the emperor provisions which are exceptional because basically, up to that point, the emperor, as the public authority par excellence, at least in nominal terms, and in fact, depending on his actual imperium capacity to manifest in the communes themselves, was historically receiving those, handling properly, those appeals against decisions by communal magistrates in cases valued above £25. In other words, if somebody from the same communes did not like what communal magistrates had done, in theory you could go to the emperor, that's very, very abstract, especially in this time, and ask for justice, with imperial law in theory being above these other ones. Naturally, this was actually partly done in the Lombard kingdom. It was in theory replicable everywhere in Europe. I mean, the king, and later the emperor, everywhere was the ultimate juridical authority for everybody involved. But the capacity to actually enact it is a completely different thing. And of course, these imperial interventions, by the way, had been established at some point because, of course, say, in Lombard times, there wasn't an emperor who could simply say to these guys what to do, given that the Longobards were also taking, Italy away from the other, say, the only emperors that existed at the time, that is the Constantinopolitans. Then aside from this, what happened at Constance is that the appeals, so the imperial courts that will receive, ideally, because also most of these issues were settled in Italy, nobody really had to cross the Alps to go to the emperor, and at some point, when the emperor came, there were these grievances that were sort of shown to him, and this was a regular thing, because they tried, there was a big guy with a big army that arrives, he can't dictate law, and he can't do it because he's the actual emperor, right? It's not some random foreign national that can't, I don't know, the French king does not have, power in the Salic kingdom, and also particular, for example, in later times, the time of the Anjou, for example, particular offices at that point were entrusted to, say, the Kingdom of Naples, but not as the Kingdom of Naples, just as, this guy that was, the brother of the King of France, but still for the specific purpose of these people. And what happens at Constance, because it's all negotiated, there isn't a capacity to impose yourself from out of nowhere simply. And again, the Peace of Constance is exactly the outcome of the Lombard League dictating, ruling its own land against the imperial army. And in this sense, the imperial court admits at Constance, hence the more theoretical and practical thing, because there wasn't much that emperors could, at that point, too much enforce, that not just, of course, imperial laws were to be used in order to fix these cases above £25, with, substantial issue, right? But that the imperial decision had to take in consideration the customs of the relevant commune, meaning that if something happened in Milan, so to say, the imperial court had to judge with the specific consideration of the Milanese statutes, the Milanese constitution, which means, in other words, that the Milanese had some important leverage on also the imperial decision, which was, as we were just saying at the beginning, the political outcome of the fact that they had won the war against Frederick Barbarossa. From the mid-12th century onward, consuls, upon assuming office, took an oath to uphold the customs and regulations established by their predecessors. This is also very relevant, because this was a collegial magistracy, akin exactly to the same Roman consuls, and that's why they were called like that. There were sometimes also more than that at a time, which was still ad hoc, often for the same statutes that were in fact updated. We've seen it in the recent video about medieval Bologna, where they arrived to 8 consuls, because it was such a big sort of more popularly oriented city, and they needed some sort of more shared level of power. This is relevant because the consuls in this regard are not much just they are, as we said in the traditional perspective, obeying to the imperium of the previous consuls. But in this sense, they are increasingly recognizing an institution that is above the single pairs of consuls that succeed one another, right? So what does this mean also in practice? That there is an entire community that is looking at you and that says, well, of course, we can't change the law of something that we don't like that the previous consular legislation had de facto issued. But you have to do so, not just thinking that you're just a random consul, doing whatever you want, but paying sort of respect to these statutes as they were piling up and forming up in a constitution. This is incredibly relevant for a number of reasons. There's a beautiful example of medieval Cremona that we've seen in other videos where literally, in fact, still the city's coat of arms is one of this hand holding a golden globe. And that's the hand, the forearm of a knight that had basically stolen this golden globe that was the regular tribute that was paid to the emperors during their Italic tours, so to say. I also recently made a video about the German ether within Germany, properly of the rulers, and how justice was served in this kind of itinerant fashion, as we just explained, and had gifted it to his fiancée. And so this noblewoman could basically claim that his men had the same level of imperium of the Germanic rulers. This gives you probably how the Lombard League rose up against the emperor and they beat him. But is it again a democratic, anti-tradition? These guys were led by freaking knights who believed that they had the imperium, even beyond what the emperor had, because freemen, right? And that's why certain readings of history is so much BS, such as the idea that this level of freedom emerged, for example, from the Barbaricum at some point. Yes, there was something like that, especially compared to Roman society in late antiquity. But if you actually look at who were the freer people in absolute terms, they were exactly the Italians at this point. As in Germany, by the way, there had never actually been any freedom, as we understand it also by, for example, the early Roman period of civitas, which was much more consistent. There had always been an aristocracy ruling on people that were de facto not really free, and especially living in much worse ways than other parts of the Mediterranean. And at this point, 12th, 13th century Germany, everybody's somebody else's people, right? Just bishops and counts rule. Just an ability. In Italy, communes led by consuls at this stage dictate rules on imperial vassals. So it's beyond this. It's not like these knights hadn't been vassals or hadn't been at the point, in fact, belonging to lineages exactly descending, even from the same, at some point, Germanic rulers. But they are in Italy, and we will see this better. That's the most identifying level of probably knightly recruitment. In Germany, it's the unfree knights, right, that become the wide majority. And hence that servant concept I was talking about before. North of the Alps, the concept of freedom does not practically exist. In Italy, it's money, it's wealth, right? So if you are just like the laws of recruitment that had already been the ones of the Longobards and any other people, but since here it's a big deal, you can have even the entire full package of knighthood, which equated to some sort of having, private jet wealth nowadays, with a war horse, the equipment, training, and so on. Achievable through, in fact, these statutes that regulate recruitment as well. We'll see this at some point from also in a military historical point of view. We made some videos already on the Italian communal military, but naturally there are so many others to make. The oath itself that the consuls had to take, detailedly expressed in this very heavily legal culture, how or why you had to introduce new provisions, respect the older consuls, legislation, etc. This practice is known as the breve consulum. That is to say, a list of the decisions of the consuls. Right? Breve is probably the list, something which in theory means short, and they weren't short much. Obviously, entailing probably what these consuls had issued. In fact, consulum, genitive plural of the consuls, which later transforms into the breve of the podestà that we mentioned before, which as a name in Italian stems obviously from the Latin potestas, which was very much, as you know, also we've seen in the videos about the traditional meaning of the patriciate of the Roman, the European legacy, probably the idea of a power wielded ex autoritate. So just like the paterfamilias had a potestas, this was, by the way, recovered exactly in Roman law in the various institutions. And that was unsurprisingly connected with the one of a guy who came from, as we've seen, abroad, dictating rule, keeping these guys well in order, but also actually depending on them. In fact, the first function of the podestà we explained was respecting the communal statutes. There were also many. This guy had to be a jurist of some sort, because imagine every council has basically its own rules, mechanisms, so on, and eventually that's why we talk states by the mid-13th century, because this sort of fluidifies towards some more compact constitution that sees the commune as the center, as opposed to a sum of guilds, like it could be, I don't know, in the Flemish cities, for example, ruled by a third estate. Now, this thing was a fully fledged actual state with all the full package. And even though the podestà will actually become just a military leader that has to command the army in time of war, the primary function was having a legal expertise to respect the statutes. All right. And the reason, as you understand, is that he had some power conferred by the same statutes, literally of police, of bringing order within the city, preventing fractures, clashes, and so on. And in this sense, having a guy super partes that could use some violence to prevent the various factions from going at each other's throat, and especially in the moment of war that required the maximum political cohesion, having a unitary direction guided by the commune, however. Right? It's not like the podestà actually decided when to summon an army. The commune, with its statutes, with its elite, with its establishment, did. And in fact, the breve of the podestà was similarly sworn by the podestà at the beginning of his term, just like the consuls had done, because the consuls had been previously, and that's why they had to swear now something more. The guys who had, as we've seen, simply taken power, had created the commune on their own, and simply commanded everybody else, including the military expeditions. That's why now you have a more concentrated power in a statal fashion that is instead unitary in nature. It's not personally based like this or that individual knight. It's really a unitary institution. In some cases, such as in Genoa, citizens may also swear a corresponding oath, by the way, to stress here not all citizens, obviously some of the most powerful, because Genoa will remain, differently, say, from Venice, for example, a much more oligarchically split, privatistically ruled commune. And so the idea that there were some citizens that did not cover specific public offices that, however, held the fact a great deal of power. And this is very much the case also because the Genoese fleet is run by all these private powers. It was similar in other maritime republics. Venice compacted earlier on, and it was in fact a more performing system, but also originally, it's not like there was properly a communal fleet. It was mostly the sum of those who were called by the commune to serve and were private means. Only later you have properly the public arsenals and something with properly states arise. You understand how important it is to study this stuff. Now, the rules embedded in these brevia, which is the plural neutrum of brevia, gradually formed the foundational core of the statutes themselves, because they were truly constitutive of the broader rule. Who could do what at the highest level? This is unsurprising. The exceptionally early and thoroughly documented example of Pisa, for example, illustrates how the brevia supplied the governing principles that consuls were obliged to follow, along with a detailed action plan, including monthly deadlines for tasks such as levying specific taxes and mustering the army. Pisa was by far one of the most civilly and Romanly ordered Italian communes. In fact, it would perform magnificently, especially in the later 13th, early 14th century, in terms of managing the popular signory, which is yet another, the most important actually phase of the Italian communal regime's succession. You had again the consular phase, the popular one de facto, and then the popular signory, which was essentially the most tempered way to, and in particular in Pisa, more than any other Italian commune institutionally and constitutionally, way to a republican monarchy. It may sound some sort of strange concept, but it's also not far at all from the same principatus in Rome. Naturally, it was something very different in Pisa at the time. But this shows that there can be, in fact, a lord without this guy taking over, and the sort of richer citizens maintaining power, also from quite, again, still military families, on top, however, of the people, of the popolo that also supported this. And many of these people, in fact, were from the popolo itself. The fate of consular, let's say, lineages sort of ceases as they were not consular anymore, but they were still there. And again, Pisa's history is particularly important. We made 2 videos, in fact, about it in order to explain how solid this commune really was. It was also one of the most performing. It was both a maritime republic and a land power, differently from the other maritime republics. Staunchly Ghibelline, by the way, and heavily informed also by Roman law through its specific recovery of some of the most important manuscripts of the Theodosian, essentially Justinian Code, from its own context with the East. Right? It's not like also other ridiculous idea that for some reason still people believe somewhere. It's not like the West at some point was exposed to manuscripts from Constantinople and the Arabs, because these civilizations, educated the Westerners notoriously went autonomously as individually educated people to fish this stuff from the libraries of those other peoples and bring it back to Italy. In this case, not knowing, because it also happened mostly from Italy, knowing in advance what was there in those libraries, and those peoples did absolutely nothing of any of this. Right? It's not like there was a legal revolution at this point in the Levant or in the Byzantine Empire. This was something mastodontic and carried out entirely in the West by Westerners for Westerners, and with an insight that nobody else had at this point. And definitely Italian communes were on the forefront in all of this, spreading it, in fact, also through the rest of Europe, but just through the sort of the universal institutions, the empire, the papacy, etc. Consuls back in the day were required to review the aforementioned memorandum in Pisa every month, and they likely referred to it even more frequently. In addition to Pisa's brevia, other notably ancient examples include those of Genoa, as we said before, Piacenza, dating back to 1168. Never made a video about Piacenza, but it's not next on the list, but we're going to cover it because it's a city of massive relevance in medieval Italy. each compilation of this reflects in its, of course, still unique way, the political and social environment of the city where the commune developed. The Genoese brevia, for example, blend political alliances with interests tied to maritime commerce, which is kind of obvious for their maritime bias, while the 1181 version, you see how they updated them from 1168, of Piacenza's brevia highlights the role of trade guilds. Piacenza would become one of the major banking hubs in textile production in Europe. In the case of Piacenza, laws passed by the assembly since 1135, we'll see this better also in other videos, had just been born, at least the later born ones. Many of them were born basically at the very end of the 11th century, most of them. And again, it's not much when the commune was born, namely, which historiographically, by the way, is conventionally the date of the first consuls registered, which means not necessarily the first consuls that had been made at the time, but once we can document. And so it's not really too helpful. Obviously, that's an important indicator. But as we explained before, the communes had already, been based on a previous city government. And so they weren't born all of a sudden from nothing. Right? I made a video specifically, which is called City Power, Urban Power Before the Communes, which explains who were also the same people who went on essentially creating the commune. And you see, these phases must all be properly understood. Consider that 200 years before there was Charlemagne, and there were the Longobards. So you understand how that speaks volumes of the important civic continuity from much earlier times that are usually not considered as civilly developed. That's particularly important in my opinion. By the way, the content of all these various statutes issues was not just preserved, but later integrated into the consular era brevia. All communes thus developed their own legislation, namely their statutes. The accumulation of text and subsequent additions renders consultation increasingly complex. For them, at the time, you can imagine for us in reconstructing this, and unfortunately, again, most of this stuff is lost. Before we made the example of Florence, because it's by far the most clamorous, given the specific Republican bias of the city, that was also relatively exceptional. The enormous material wealth, the preservation of the archives, and so on. Very strong communal and somehow liberal mentality for the time. Just recently resumed some Milanese content to draw properly the parallel, the counter position between the third more consistent tyranny. But you see that, for example, was a model of rule in Milan that, although was sources, although lost were similarly and actually also more developed historically in the same Florentine one. I mean, Milan had been the largest city in the West, had been just emerging from the heartland, properly of the Italic capitals, kingdoms. The same Milan at some point had been the capital of the empire. But between Pavia, Monza, the crowning sees of in fact, the Italic kings, it had an enormous Palatine Roman legal tradition, also well throughout the Longobardy era, that was incredibly different from Florence. In fact, Florence was mostly just more third estate emerging, right? Eventually, there was always a level of nobility, but the Milanese were something completely different. For example, they never had a popular government. They always had equally split the clergy, the nobility, and the popolo, more or less sort of counterbalancing one another. And again, really important, at some point, studying the Archbishopric of Milan in its metropolitic power throughout the communal era. Considered that the bishops, who said it before, historically had de facto the same power that the communes had, because the communes are born largely by usurping, or at least acting namely on behalf of the bishop, because he was a count and so had rule on the district as well. This was typical of the Italic kingdom since the Ottonian era, but also because of just the aforementioned municipal traditions, especially in cities like Milan. We know throughout all the early Middle Ages, there is a massive, for example, epigraphic tradition of showing off like the most powerful families. Those were the ones of the militas historically. So it's really a lot of stuff, and we shall make many more videos, especially about early and high medieval history before the communes as well, because of course of this we're never going to run out. As a result, beginning the second quarter of the 13th century, statutes are organized by subject matter, because they're starting to branch into various institutes that basically will have to use them, governmentally speaking. These arrangements, however, themselves quickly became outdated as new provisions were incorporated and older ones fell into disuse. Until the late 13th century, statutes are recopied with a comprehensive reorganization, each time to accommodate the growing volume of laws and potential revisions to existing ones. At this point, we're really in an advanced state, where the mechanism points to, in fact, uniforming, consolidating a constitutional basis with some ever more sort of fully integrated legal material, right? And the stuff was researched in relatively recent times by the so-called Münster group in Germany, led by Hagen Keller, demonstrating how these periodic reorganizations refreshed the archival system. You can literally say most of this is done philologically, but also in the archives. Sometimes you literally find the certification, which allows you also to more easily access to the statutes, because you know essentially more or less better how the stuff is ordered. Naturally, it's a thankless job. I personally don't know how these people can, become superficial. I mean, what kind of anthropological type can become devoted in this stuff? And I don't know, it's also pretty badass, pretty interesting, because again, it requires an enormous dedication. Consider that all this must be done mostly by eye, also knowing how to recognize all the diplomatic level of production, the codicology of it, the paleography. And it's not like, by the way, in the archives, you're the first one who has entered. Many of these sources have also been reordered in the modern age, etc. But from their content, there is some possibility of putting things together once you become more aware of specific dynamics, mechanisms, marks, seals, and so on. And the task of reorganizing these texts necessitates the development of methods for managing communal records, such as the indices, cross-referencing system, etc. I don't know what kind of application in the time of AI can be made at this point. In any case, probably fairly scarce, because the capacity properly to read this still of AI to simply interpret specific texts is very low, and likely this stuff, especially at the doctoral level, cannot be reached by in any near future by technological advancement. Besides, they must all be digitalized, which for entire archival sources is also, you're going to damage some of it in part. And again, some archives are so vast, and so the scope also of the research only gradually moves that at that point it's easier to process the various statutes just through, some human pacing of more, traditional nature. This is valid for any archival collection, by the way, including classification, labeling, summaries. There are many sources, again, on top of the statutes that you must read, because the same jurists that were writing the stuff were also teaching law, were formulating new theories, and all let's stress this, in a world where there was no state, if not exactly being established in the moment and just in these communities. And so everything was in theory on the basis of these legals and their intuitions to a degree. They were incredibly informed. Again, these people learned the entire Roman law by heart. This was part properly of the juridical training of the time. Good luck in trying to do something like this today, without mentioning even the comments, all the glosses that were essentially over, expanding the juridical texts material. Now, these methods which enhance also usability and consultations are also evident in other types of documents, such as university texts, surprisingly. For instance, consider the systems developed for locating specific themes or subjects. This is typical also of the times, the 13th century. Think about this massive Gothic, in Italy not so much, there was especially some chancery writing, at least in a statutory sense, but still legal codes were being copied and distributed in increasingly sort of irregimented categories. Think about scholastics, even from a philosophical point of view. Every subject was disciplined in an overarchingly unitary sense, hierarchically speaking. So it's an incredibly sophisticated work. Because they helped each other at the time, of course, working better. So the process also of why does Gothic look like the way it does, and why the codices are changing like that. It's all for an eminently practical purpose that you must be able to properly appreciate in the moment you get these manuscripts in your hands. You lay eyes on the writing, on the script. It's if you're skilled in those subjects, I had to study them for a long time. I can tell you that it is very fascinating. It was probably not cut for, especially for codicology, maybe paleography, I don't know. Apparently it had a good eye, but it was incredibly lazy in memorizing the modern terminology for this or that tiny, trait that characterized that letter. That was actually boring, and in general, I studied warfare, which seems sort of more appropriate for my nature. But in the later era, the one of lordships, that we also have to make more content on, particularly in their early phases when the transition from, let's say, a more communal, straightforwardly communal regime that will always remain there. Like the commune was, in any case, the basis for the city-state. So the lords had emerged very often from the same ether. I mean, families that across generations had gradually also controlled statutes, production. They had influence in them, had control, interfere with them, but also in a legal fashion, and gradually heading towards like the conferment of greater powers and so on. They would end up, in fact, producing statutes that subtly or overtly incorporated the principle of the Lord's supremacy. We will see it better in another video. Again, I made an entire one, for example, describing the notion of tyranny that I was hinting at before in terms of also the despots that was once used in, especially in Anglosphere, to describe the Italian lords, which, however, were at the head at the time of the single most egalitarian and liberal power systems. Like if these were tyrants, what was any other power anywhere else? Literally, monarchies, principalities. So it's interesting to appreciate always the backbone of this power. The fact that the city maintained its own active, let's say, delegation and legitimizing function for whichever ruler would eventually be accepted, because he could have not properly acted in any political or institutional framework without a commune. It was obviously all based on that, and so it's completely normal to assess at the same time. And once these lordships became firmly established, interestingly enough, the statutes even tend to become fixed. So the previous fluidity, malleability, etc. Sort of ends, because everything is functionalized mostly for not necessarily multiple cities government, but also, especially in those, in fact, we've seen it with Milan recently, video about Giangliazzo Visconti, those states were truly properly more states and trying to uniform all the various communes statutes to administer them in a more effective way, even though they remain always different by some degree. Then there were some monocity signories that also tended to do that, because, why would you change a system that also with the mid-14th century crisis tends to collapse and sort of, ruinously end at some point? Any sort of broader social mobility growth, at least we've seen what the Ancien regime turned into just out of the mechanisms of the era. For example, exactly in the aforementioned Lombardy or the Visconti, many cities finalized their statutes during the 14th century following models imposed by the dominant city. And that is really typical because also the Lombard ones in the Po Valley had this ancient connection, right? Tuscany, for example, was much more fragmentary or divided, had sort of different sort of niche traditions. Lombardy at least facilitated the task so much so that it became, in fact, the more state of all the states. What to say, finally? Well, again, talking about Italian communal institutional history is probably one of the most difficult things I've ever made online, because it's like, again, I've learned the stuff only through the academia. I've never really seen anything being discussed out there on YouTube, for example, by anyone. And I explained at the beginning also why that seems to be the case in many sort of different prejudicial ways. It's really difficult for many people just to accept the existence of this type of civilization, its scale, its extent, its mechanisms, how or why this had emerged objectively. You can't see the reason or how or why. There is a very disconcertingly disproportionate sense of how sort of major topics sort of medieval history are proposed since school. There is no, again, dimension of the wall of medieval civilization. This is what unfortunately boils down to the idea of understanding history. Think about this, like we went to school and we had some actually solid education. Nowadays kids don't have that. They don't learn it for some reason, and there is some sort of weird unsophisticated collectaneous anecdotal meme culture, and they're supposed to replace that, and without any of the depth, the critical analysis and the comparative approach that is really necessary to understand the past. So talking about this is, again, I've also by this time gotten considerable experience in the sense that this was part of some of our earliest topics. Here I see medieval Italian communes, 123. And it's strange here, by the way, that I surely miscounted something, because the European ones there are others that should be bigger. We missed probably some video. This is not so important. Also because I don't think that there is this enormous amount of views for the playlist, considering also how old that is. Yeah, it's not that bad. It's relatively modest. However, for the breadth and scope of it all, and institutional history is that relevant. I have a playlist title of probably medieval government that I don't know how often people watch. Here is slightly larger, and we are so this makes watch even less, right? So it is disappointing. It is, because understanding how the systems worked is the only way you can understand anything of them, and that's why I insist so much on the necessity of this type of approach. if you just watch things because of ethnicistic reasons, you're done for with any moral or scientific understanding of reality. Also in an ethnic sense, because you basically don't understand what that is meant to be traditionally or spiritually. You can't enact its potential by not embracing the core functioning of the world. And that is truly despicable and disturbing. Accomplice to this was some sort of course, socioeconomic bias attached to the notion that if you study this, it's just socioeconomics. There is some structuralistic flavor to that. That's the point. This system worked just because men made it work. Otherwise, it would have not existed. And this is the great mystique, magic, and sort of power, prestige of politics, of moral forces, of war, of religious beliefs surrounding the metaphysical licity of such communities, by the way, that, as we've seen, took properly up arms against what had to be the universals already failing in that sense to taint them, as it should have been the case. This is, again, often understood as some anti-traditional mechanism. It's not like there weren't movements or further degradation throughout all this history, like anywhere else, that testify to the gradual departure from more traditional views. But in the Middle Ages, by our own standards, it was traditional as hell, and the foundations for these communities were normal from millennia, and they would be changed just in the last couple of centuries of today's world. Equally, that's what is sort of perplexing and disturbing, how the traditional nature of city-states, of republican regimes, of how these communes worked, has been despoiled of its political, military, religious relevance and reduced to some sort of socio-economical issue. And this is valid for the Hellenic polis, for the Roman civitas. It's as if, I don't know, the systems had been in the pseudo-traditionalistic imagination anti-traditional. And they were actually the most successfully traditional. If you study especially the history of Roman law, you realize that this not just was born as common law, but was enforced later as common law in Europe by also just the sheer recovery, the effectiveness of the recovery. And for a reason that, again, was wanted, that succeeded in times when, I don't know, also the Reformation was there. So, unfortunately, that's why it's difficult to make this history, because it's as if people didn't properly want to understand that most of the paradigms that have been lamely sort of established in their mind for some sort of essential social cultural shortcoming are not representative of reality, right? There is a universal dimension that if you don't take into consideration, or that you just switch from out or in just at your own whim to fit your own inconsistency, you will always set you apart from actual traditional history. And this is definitely a problem, and that's why these videos are so necessary at the end of the day, because they show you the measure of that failure. But I already know that making these videos is like, I don't know, throwing a punch in the water. I mean, it's like, yeah, in the moment, people seem to listen, to care, but then they just don't get it. They're not, as if they were not programmed to receive it. And that's, again, a huge sociocultural issue we were talking about before, regarding also the collapse of standards. There are people who would pay enormously to receive this education, but since they see it on YouTube, or they don't understand maybe even what I'm saying, it's that they don't have the compass to appreciate it unless they stop sort of listening, which may also happen. But it's that rare exactly to do so. And here I see only just always the same videos watched, rewatched, and or you can always almost always understand for which reason in particular. Again, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but this channel, you see, I can't make so many views if I make a video about the Romans and the Germans. If I make a video about this that is, debatably more important, About, I don't know, the last battle of Arshorn Ridge, for example. A beautiful video, but at least the topic I enjoyed very much discussing and everything. I hope that you liked the video. I see, again, you watch it, it gets lots of views, but every time it's government, no, I don't want to listen to that. I see it through analytics. Again, at some point I can show you in a more graphically consistent fashion, visually consistent fashion, but let's say that's the problem. For example, the video here about medieval Serbian army organization and strength. Once people liked Serbian history, I don't know, it became less relevant to an extent. I don't know, made lots of videos about that they used to be watched, and there is something narrowing down to just specific topics, just like the religious one, certain ethnic ones, and shrinking to, I don't know, some level of... The only advantage of this is that some videos that I make in between anyway end up having more visibility because of it. They end up being watched more just because you had specifically more consistent level of traffic that brings people to inadvertently also probably look at this stuff. And so I would say this is also done. We have to make so many videos, but we have no idea how many. I don't do that often because, again, I understand myself, as I said at the beginning of the video, that there's a component of it that, is not that thrilling perhaps in the moment, but I think the way I explain it highlights at least the aspects that are actually cooler and that are, however, so dreadfully overlooked. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.